So again, thank you for being here this evening. Welcome as we gather for this pre-assembly meeting focused on the investment ministry plan for 2026 and 2027 and on the compensation guidelines. As we were getting ready for the meeting this evening, we realized that the email that went out this morning did not include the compensation guidelines. So I am dropping those in the chat as we speak. They'll be in a follow-up email, so we apologize for that, but I'll walk through all of those pieces before the evening is over. I'm Pastor John Wertz. I am one of the assistants to the bishop in the Virginia Synod, and I'm also the director for evangelical mission. Happy this evening to have with us John Krallman. He is the treasurer for the Virginia Synod. He'll be doing most of the talking about the investment ministry plan. I saw Bishop Milton there at some point. She's with us as well. And Pastor Colin from our office, who's our director of digital ministry, she is with us as well. So we give thanks for your presence here this evening. And for those of you that are going to be watching this and it's recorded, we appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit about the ministry we're doing through the investment ministry plan and through the recommended compensation guidelines for 2026. With that, let's have a moment of prayer, and then I will turn it over to John Krallman. Let us pray. Loving God, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for the gift of the empty tomb and the risen Lord. We thank you for the ways that we unite our gifts to do the ministry that you call us to do. And we pray that you would guide us this evening as we talk about our investment ministry plan, as we talk about the recommended compensation guidelines for 2026. Give us your wisdom. Help us to have good questions and good understanding. We ask all of this in your name we pray. Amen. The other thing we do when we gather like this is we share in a land acknowledgement. So even though we're not in a particular spot, we're all scattered around, we still want to share that acknowledgement as a part of the ministry you do and a part of the way that we are church together. So let me share that. As we gather today on Zoom from across the Virginia Synod for a pre-assembly workshop, the Virginia Synod Office of the Bishop wishes to acknowledge and honor the indigenous peoples upon whose ancestral homelands we gather. The Virginia Synod Office of the Bishop is located on the original and ancestral homelands of the Tutelo and the Monacan peoples. That's our Western Office of the Bishop in Salem. And the Chesapeake and the Lumbee peoples. That's the Eastern Office of the Bishop in Norfolk. And we give thanks for their presence here since time immemorial. We also wish to recognize and honor all our indigenous siblings who have and continue to call this land their home. So with that, John, I will turn it over to you.
We had two handouts. One was a write-up that kind of talked a little bit about the different aspects of the budget, and then the other one was the budget itself. We're going to move to the budget here shortly and can kind of cover some of the things that we've got in a write-up. If you've got questions, you can go ahead and ask them after I get through my initial kind of introduction here, because I would like to have a conversation if you do have questions as we go along. I kind of want to start with saying that over a year ago, the finance team and the bishop's staff realized that we were having some issues with our budget, and particularly looking at 2024 and what was budgeted. We ended the year about $300,000 short in our giving, and so we actually ended up with a deficit of about $230,000, if I remember correctly, $213,000. For 2024. That our fiscal year ends January 31st. So when I talk about our fiscal year 2024, it would be 2023, 2024 was ended about 200,000 short. So the finance team has actually been very much looking at cash flow and where we're at for about a year now. Last summer, we sat down and said we've got to really look at our how we budget and what our budgets are, and trying to make sure that we put a budget together that's realistic, that's one that we can meet, and also one that over time we're going to get back to being in the black. The Synod does have financial resources to be able to absorb some of the deficits that we've had over the last several years. We've not had a year that ending in black since the 2021 year. So it was 2020, 2021, where we ended with a positive cash value. Since then, we have been in a deficit position, and we're going to be monitoring this closely as we have been, and are going to be working on trying to, one, reduce costs where we can without significantly impacting mission, as well as looking at our and other financial assets to see how we can make sure that we use those as appropriately as possible, and also I guess recover funds from them as best as we can. We have investments, for example, that we have done fairly well with over the last couple of years. What I've done here is I've shown our 2024 preliminary. That's actually end of year would be January of 25. So it's fiscal year 24, end of year would be January 31st of this year. We ended up with a deficit of about $142,000, which was 80,000 better than where we were, 60,000 better than where we were at the end of last year. We really looked at our mission support and said, okay, where, what do we need to budget? And so our plan for this year is at 1.5. We're proposing for 26 to be conservative on that, and also budget 21.5, and hope that by 2027 we can increase that a little bit. That increase to 1.53 is about a 2% increase. As we went through and looked at expenses, one of the things that we can do, and we had some significant discussion about, was mission support to ELCA. We have varied over the years, over the last 10 to 15 years, anywhere from 35 to 50%. Is that correct, John? Yes. We have been at 40% over the last couple of years. We are recommending that we reduce that to 36% in our budgets for the next 2 years. That would be a minimum support. If we have enough resources, we would hope that we can raise that, but that's what our budget is. When we talk about a budget, I think one of the things that's important to understand is a budget doesn't say this is what we're actually going to spend and this is what we're actually going to get. The spending plan is really a kind of a maximum. We're not going to spend more than what we have budgeted without coming back and getting some approval for that. So the budget is really a ceiling on spending, and it's our best conservative guess on revenues. So think about a budget from that perspective. And so we said what we want to do is we want to reduce that to 36%. And that is what's reflected in this budget. And in effect, in addition, we said this is something that we can impact this year, because this year is not looking real good either. And so we, as of April 1st, reduced support to churchwide to 36%. Before we made this decision, we did look at other synods to see how we compare to other synods. And we are still right in the ballpark as to what other synods are giving to national, with just this 4% reduction from 40 to 36. So we've talked with national about it. They recognize that this is what we're recommending. So that's kind of the biggest major change that we've got in the budget. Beyond that, things are fairly, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of same level budgeting. Staff, we have built in a 4% increase based on just what we anticipate as being the top end of staff increases. And then as we go down, everything else is pretty much as we anticipate. It's either steady state or things that we know that are going to potentially increase. I think one of the big ones that I know we've had some conversations with is audit costs. We're planning on going to a new financial system at the end of this fiscal year, so we'll convert it next year. At the end of that year, the first audit is probably going to be more expensive, so we have built that into the 27 budget. With that, I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions.
Treasurer John, there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
There's two there now. The first one is staff reduction and options since it's the biggest part of the budget.
We have had preliminary conversations about that. Yes, we have talked about that. At this point in time, there's nothing that we can really talk about saying, yes, this is where we're going to go. But that is certainly, when you look at the budget, the largest percentage of cost is in staff. Now, the thing that you got to understand, if we reduce staff, then there's a large possibility you're going to reduce mission support. And so this is something that we have had more than preliminary discussions about, but nothing has been finalized.
What ID included in the budget line item total that is labeled other?
Okay, the ones that we've got down there is one is furnishings and equipment. That's kind of an other, and I believe the 25, that 3,000 should probably be in that line, not as a contingency. We do not have a contingency. That's if we have to have purchase furnishing equipments, we've got a budget of 3,000. Capital replacement is something new that we're putting into 26 and 27. We have a number of vehicles in the Synod that are getting old, that are going to have to be replaced. And rather than waiting until the time where we have to actually go out and purchase a new vehicle at a high cost, we're trying to put money aside on a yearly basis to help support that. And that's what the $12,000 is going to be for there. And then the 5,000 is the bishop's discretionary fund. That's something that's always been in the budget. Sometimes it gets spent, sometimes it does not.
Yes, one question. I see a number of Synod ministry items that are budgeted but had no expense in 2024. Are there plans for executing on those budget items in 26 and 27?
Yes, and some of those are things that we have had as placeholders that where we've held the money to be able to use it when we have different programs going on. So, for example, the global missions team, we had a group that went to Papua New Guinea, and so we actually used that money to save up so that when we have folks from our companion synod come, we have money to spend for that or money to spend to send people over. I want to say it cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000 or so, I think, to send our team over for our visit. And that's money that we had accumulated over years. So in some cases, we're holding on to things. In some cases, we plan to spend money, but then didn't have to, but we anticipate that we will. So we've taken some of them out, the ones that we didn't think would get spent, and the ones that we think have a high likelihood of getting spent have stayed in going forward.
I think the other thing to say about this, John, would be that if we really have budget pressures, these are the kinds of things that we would try not to spend.
Right.
Okay, thank you. That helps clarify quite a bit. And I know you probably weren't turning this into a debate, but I do support the 4% increase for staff. I think investing in your people is very important.
Yes, yes. I see another question about what are the vehicles used for? Those are the staff vehicles. That's how the bishop and her staff get around the state and can come visit you.
And just to put a little framework on that, the cost, some of you work with your own congregations with mileage reimbursement and what the cost of mileage reimbursement is. Um, I, for one, drive about 40,000 miles a year. I don't know what the bishop's numbers are, but they got to be close to that. Um, we did the math, and if I was using my car and you all and the Synod was reimbursing me for miles, that would be a $30,000 plus reimbursement a year. So what the Synod has traditionally done, we have a policy for folks who are driving more than 20,000 miles a year. It becomes far cheaper for us to have vehicles than to pay mileage reimbursement. And so far, we've done pretty well. Mine has 212,000 miles on it, and it's going strong. So that's also why the capital replacement, one of the reasons the capital replacement fund is there, because it does have 212,000 miles on it. But so that's what the vehicles are used for.
There's one more that just
One more?
came into
Okay.
the chat.
Yes.
What are the women in ministry?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have had in the past a retreat for rostered ministers in the Virginia Synod, women, female rostered ministers. That retreat hasn't happened in a couple of years, and the plan hopefully is to have that happen again. And so that's money has been used to underwrite those retreats when they have been able to happen.
And another one popped in. What do you think is the reason for the deficit in the budget?
Can I speak first to that, to one part of it, John, and then you can
Yes.
take the second
Yes.
part?
Sure.
So the first thing I want to say is uh, things just get more expensive. So John will probably say a word more about that.
Yeah.
The other piece, though, that I want to make sure folks know is that congregations have continued to give generously to the Virginia Synod. In fact, giving has, for a number of years, giving was decreasing a little bit. Over the last couple of years, that has stabilized and started to increase a tiny little bit each year over the last 2 years. So giving is strong, but we approve these plans a year and 2 years in advance. And so we're now trying to right size to what the giving is from congregations, which again has continued to be strong and is stable and is starting to grow again. So that's adjusting to that as part of the story. John, I'll let you build on that.
Well, and I think adjusting to that is part of the story, and where the adjustment has come in this budget is that as I look back over the budgets over the last 5 years, we didn't recognize the decline that we had in giving, and so our budgets were budgeted at what the prior level was, and so the last couple of years we've run those deficits. Now what we're saying is, look, we're going to budget as to what we're really anticipating, expecting. This is, as I said, this is a conservative estimate on our giving for this year. This 1.5 million. We think, in fact, we kind of already know we're gonna hit that number this year, and hopefully that will happen next year and the year after with some little increase. However, by making that adjustment in the budget on the revenue side, it really opens up, hey, look, we don't have the revenues to continue over the long haul to be able to do the same level of expenditures that we have been. And so that's why we're going to continue to look at our expenditures and try to make sure that we are conservative in actually making those expenditures. And as I said, as I pointed out earlier, this budget from an expenditure standpoint puts a ceiling on what we're going to spend. It doesn't mean that we're going to spend all of that. That means that's the ceiling. And the finance team, along with the bishops and the bishop's staff, will continue on a monthly basis taking a look at this and making sure that we right size as well as possible, so that we can start to bring that deficit back down to a manageable level and eventually get back into the black here in the next 2 to 3 years.
Says again,
Yeah.
for those in the recording, thank you. It's good to hear the contributions are beginning to increase, and
They have.
yeah, yeah. All right. Well, we'll move on to the
Yeah.
compensation guideline recommendations, and then if you think of other questions, we can certainly come back at the end and pick those up. So as we move into conversation about the compensation guideline recommendations, want to just give a little framework. For as long as I can remember, and I've been in the Virginia Synod now for 20 years, we have had the same basic approach to compensation guidelines. That approach has revolved around sort of a stair-step model, and I'll put that up on the screen here in just a second. Over the last couple of years, there have been some questions about if that was appropriate going forward, and so we gathered a team of folks from around the Synod to do a review of our compensation guidelines. We looked at comparison guidelines in terms of what folks were being paid from all of our regional Region 9 synods, and then we pulled data from comparable synods that had some large areas and rural areas combined, and looked at those sets of numbers to see if we were in line with everybody else, if we were out of line with folks. And so from that work, we've got a new proposal we want to share with you. But before I show you the new one, I want to just call up the old one just as a reminder of what we have done. So for a number of years, we have used something that looks like this. And this version of it has multiple potential increases. And I'll remind folks about why that exists in just a second. But the way it basically works in this approach to compensation guidance is that you look however many years the person has been ordained, you go across and you find a number, and that's the minimum compensation recommendation. During the pandemic, I think it was still during the pandemic, it all kind of runs together. When the cost of living jumped about 9% in 1 year, the Virginia Synod had traditionally always just recommended that these numbers increase by the cost of living. And that year, it just seemed unrealistic to recommend a 9% jump in a single year. I think it was actually 8.6. And so that year, we introduced these ranges of recommendations for increases to say, if you're thinking about a 3% increase in 2025, this is the column of numbers. If you're thinking about a 25% increase, this is the column of numbers. A 7% increase, this is the column of numbers. And then we always included the 3% base from the previous year as a point of comparison. So you could see, where did these numbers come from? Well, it's 3% off of this one, it's 5% off of this one, it's 7% off of this one. This approach, fairly common, had been or has been fairly common in some government settings. A lot of teacher contracts use similar approaches. And this is what we have used for a long time. Let me stop so I can see everybody again. What we discovered as we've been doing that work is that that structure was becoming very difficult for congregations and for pastors and for deacons. The way it worked really took out a lot of flexibility in the conversations about how do we negotiate these numbers, what's appropriate for different places. So the first adjustment we made a couple of years ago, some of you may remember, is that we added a cost of living adjustment that says, because in this synod, we have folks that we have congregations, I should say, where the average cost of a house is $120,000. And we have other places in this synod where the average cost of a house is $640,000. And we were all working off of the same guidelines. So we introduced an adjustment based on cost of living in a particular area. And there's a spreadsheet that's still going to exist that allows for that kind of work to be done. And so that was a helpful step for a lot of folks to say, we need to adjust based on, if a house costs $640,000, then the recommended minimum compensation goes up. If it costs $120,000, that recommendation actually goes down. So we introduced that, but that still didn't quite feel like we'd hit all of the right ways to work on this. And so from that, then the task force put together a new set of recommendations. So let me put this up on the screen because I want to walk you through three things, I think. So the first is, this is what the proposal is that comes from the Synod Council. So Synod Council has recommended this to the Synod. And if you scroll down through this, you'll see this little note that says, as you read through this document, sections that are highlighted in yellow are substantive changes from 25 to 26. Things that are in gray are time-sensitive things that will get changed right closer to once we actually get to 2026. So that's kind of the key for the way the document works. And as you scroll down, let me show you some examples of this. So this is one of the places where the change. Compensation guidelines recommend a minimum cash compensation that includes salary, housing allowance, self-employment tax compensation. In place of the grid with suggested raises based on years of experience, the guidelines now suggest appropriate ranges based on years of experience. In determining compensation, consideration should be given to complexity of call and the cost of living. So that, in practice, looks like, get down to it. There we go. Looks like this. And so in place of those charts that we've had in the past, the recommendation coming now looks at a range and says, for roster ministers who have no experience to 8 years of experience, this is a typical range, the recommended range for compensation. From 9 to 17, this is the range. 18 to 24, this is the range. 25, that's the minimum, and that's where we stop the recommendations. These numbers all are based off of the last version of that chart, the 3% chart. And then going forward, these are the numbers that would be adjusted by cost of living. The reason for the somewhat odd break in years, not doing like a 5, 10, 15, 20, is that this reflects more of the averages of when folks move from a first or second to third kind of call across a career. And so this felt like a more natural break point. You can see that is for a housing allowance is here, and this is what those numbers would be for a parsonage, and these are the numbers for a deacon. Everything else pretty much in the guidelines has stayed the same in terms of recommendations around healthcare and reimbursements and all of those pieces really have stayed basically the same. This is the significant change that's been introduced this year as a recommendation to create a little more flexibility. When I talk about flexibility, it's a both-and-ness of flexibility. On one hand, it's flexibility for congregations as they look at what's an appropriate compensation for a rostered minister. On the other side, it gives it gives the roster ministers a chance to say, hey, this is an acceptable salary to me. The previous guidelines created some situations where we had people with um, experience who were coming from other synods that had lower compensation guidelines, where they were saying, hey, I'm potentially going to get a nice raise here, but because it didn't meet our guidelines, we couldn't consider it a full-time call, even though it was a significant change for that person. It also helps us out with some folks who are maybe towards the latter part of their career, who want to move from one place to another, who are looking at perhaps going for a slightly lower salary to find a different kind of location to be. And so the idea here is to try to give us more flexibility in those conversations as we look at what does a healthy compensation package look like for everybody involved. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody, but I will put this back up on the screen as needed. Um,
John, I've got a question. How were the ranges determined? Not the years, but the actual dollar numbers.
Yeah, so the first dollar, those initial ranges we set were based off of the numbers that existed this year for 2025 was the starting point because when we did comparisons against our uh, Region 9 partner synods, and then when we looked at those other synods to give us comps, um, we were in a pretty good spot compared to everybody else. And so we decided to really translate those numbers into these ranges and then start building from that going forward.
I thought I heard, and I was trying to get back to it, some comment about complexity of call. And I kind of wanted you to speak to that. For example, I could think of what I would consider a complex call might be a piece of cake for an experienced pastor. So what constitutes a complex call?
Yeah, and that
I think
so
that's a very odd term to use because what might be complex for you might be something that somebody else would really like.
yes. Complexity in this sense means mostly it falls into two categories. So one would be, are you ahead of staff? The adjustment, I didn't put up the Excel sheet, but I can if folks want to see it. The adjustments that exist in our Excel sheet that looks at compensation range around supervising staff. How many folks are you supervising? That quote increases the complexity of the call. Um, so on one hand, there is that piece that relates to the number of people you're overseeing from a working staff perspective. On the other side, complexity of call is, if you're managing, you're under call to 3 congregations in a partnership, that can be pretty complex too. So the acknowledgement there, I think, or the hope there is that folks will look at their own situation and determine, okay, does this feel like it fits into a um, uh, uh, standard range, or are there other things about this call that make it more complicated for us for somebody to serve as a leader in that congregation? So yeah, it's kind of a nebulous term, but it's meant to get people to think about it and think about how does your particular call line up?
John, you mentioned I guess, some of the pros of this new plan. Are you able to speak to any of the cons that the council debated?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so the upside of this is without a doubt flexibility of this approach. The downside of this really speaks to some of the work we have done over the last 6 years about ensuring fair compensation for all rostered ministers. As maybe some folks know, maybe you don't, historically, female pastors and deacons and individuals who were of color or whose primary language was other than English have been compensated at a lower rate than white males, basically. We've done a lot to close that gap, and having those hard numbers in the chart makes that conversation a little easier to have because it was not much in the way of negotiating. This is the bottom figure. You either hit this bottom figure or it's not a choice. And so moving off of that certainly opens up the work we're going to have to do to make sure that everyone continues to be fairly compensated. So that's definitely probably the biggest, the biggest issue. The second, maybe a second issue there is it actually becomes more of a negotiation. And so there is work to be done between uh, call committees and congregations and roster ministers and the office of the bishop staff to say, okay, this is the range. Where does this call fit in that range? Where does this person fit in that range as a leader? And how are we going to fairly compensate them? So those probably are the two hardest, two downsides. Flexibility obviously being the best upside. One more I want to point to it's not new to this particular it's not new to this particular thing. The part that is we need to think about for our adjustments we do for cost of living is that when we retirement contributions are based on defined compensation. So just from the simplest of math, um, if the defined compensation was $10,000, that wouldn't actually be a call, but if it was $10,000 and the contributions to uh, sorry, got distracted by the question. I'll get back to your question just a second. And the contribution then is 12% of $10,000, and somebody else's compensation is $20,000 because they live somewhere more expensive, and so they get a higher. Then both those people are going to have contributions made at the same percentage. But someone who's in a less expensive place to live has a smaller contribution made to their retirement funds. And someone who is in a more expensive place to live has a higher contribution made to their retirement funds. Uh, and so there's some justice equity things that we need to think about in those situations when we adjust for cost of living in an area, about the possibility of needing to make additional contributions to increase retirement contributions, so that is not a detriment when roster ministers are looking at calls in some of these places that are less expensive places to live. But if I'm going somewhere that's less expensive to live, great. Um, but if I'm having $1,000 put away for retirement, but if I go somewhere that's more expensive to live, I have $2,000 put away for retirement. Well, that's something that's got to get figured into the equation. So those are all parts of this balancing act that we're trying to work on, realizing that compensation guidelines just are they're not perfect, but no matter what we do, but we're trying to improve them and continue to strengthen them each and every time. The question of what can we do to help, here the word is poorer congregations who can't meet these guidelines. So we're doing a couple of things. One of the things that I spend some, one of the things that we are working with congregations on is trying to understand how do we lift up and support lay leaders in congregations, and how do we create creative collaborative partnerships to create the potential for full-time calls in places where congregations might not be able to afford full-time pastoral leadership. If we look back across the church history, 100 years ago, you would have one pastor serving 3 or 4 or 5 congregations. That was fairly normal. And then lay leaders were doing ministry, and it was a big collaborative partnership piece. 50s, 60s, 70s, we got to a point where we basically taught everybody that everybody should have their own full-time pastor. And that was, in a lot of places, an affordable thing to do. The finances around having staff members have changed dramatically. It's just very expensive to have someone to be a staff member at a congregation. And so to find ways to make that work, we're trying to look at situations that work together, partnerships. Sometimes that works great, sometimes it doesn't, but we keep trying to find those right fits. So, for example, I was just at a church this weekend where we have a partnership between a congregation and a senior living facility. And so the pastor is half-time chaplain at the senior living facility, half-time pastor at the congregation. And so that's been the kind of thing that allows the creation of a full-time call. And so far seems to be working well. So we're trying these pieces in various places. We're still learning. It's been, like I said, we did this a lot 100 years ago, and now we're learning how to do it again and figuring out all the different ways that we need to adjust to make this work now.
I'm also curious to know what the best practices you suggest for engaging in that discussion are.
Yeah, so one of the things that the task force that worked on this proposal originally said to the Synod Council was, if this approach seems helpful and if this approach is recommended to the Synod, then we want to continue the work we've been doing and put together a list of best practices to help have those engagements, to have those conversations, to help that discussion move forward. So that group is actually meeting again next Monday to start that work, to pull that from a number of different sources. So our hope is that, and our plan, I guess, is that if this is approved as the approach by the assembly, then we will have another document, another set of best practices to roll out to go with this to say, okay, here's how we look at making these decisions. Here's how we look at having these conversations. Here's how we look at evaluations and conversations from year to year about compensation. So I don't actually have an answer yet, but we have a Zoom meeting set with those people for next Monday evening about this time.
And Brent's second question there, how much involvement do you foresee from the Synod office in those congregations? The conversation.
That's a hard one. And it goes to one of the questions from earlier in the chat as well. So let me approach it from two spots, and there's Bishop. Bishop can join in if she wants to. So on one hand, historically, the Synod has primarily been involved in the initial negotiations for a call. And then once that has happened, congregations and rostered ministers have negotiated most of that themselves after that initial work. So the Synod's primary involvement has been on the front end. Whether that evolves and changes in this case, hard to know. We still got to work on the best practice piece. My guess is that the Synod's main involvement would be doing some training events, trying to help people have conversations, learn how to have the conversations. We have at times, as an office of the bishop staff, been asked to come in and be part of conversations to help navigate ongoing questions or things that are developing. And I think certainly the staff would be and will be willing to do that. The piece that I would say ties into the earlier question about whether or not staff reduction is a possibility as it relates to um, um, changing what we do to bring the finances into closer alignment. There comes a point as we change staffing structures that the Synod will have to pick what the priorities are. If you've got, just like you do in a congregation, when I do the work with congregations to think about part-time ministry, one of the questions I always ask is, so what are we going to stop doing? With, what are those things that the roster minister absolutely needs to do? What are those things that the folks in the congregation plan to do? And what are those things that we're just going to not have as a priority right now? And so certainly if we change our staffing structure, those are all questions that we'll have to talk about as a Synod, and whether that's one of the things that makes the top of the list of stuff staff from the office of the bishop will do. That's something that'll have to be determined down the road. So that's where all of those pieces to me are kind of interacting and not completely clear yet. Let me read this question in the chat. I think my other questions will probably come after any chance to follow up once we get to okay. Sure. The question was, any chance that folks can follow up with additional questions once you get to really sit and do this? Absolutely. You can reach out. The easiest thing would be to reach out to me, Pastor. Also, certainly at the assembly, we will have these compensation guidelines will be presented, and there'll be an opportunity to debate and discuss those there.
Yeah, this was too complicated to put in a written text, but so I'm just going to ask the elephant in the room question because that's who I am. I know, we're a federated congregation, and I know that this is certainly true on the Episcopal side as well, that our numbers of seminary grads and just available clergy are way down. And I think none of us ever would want to consider that, I went into healthcare because I wanted to help people. And clergy, certainly they have calls and are responding to much more than just costs. But is the need to look, or the push to look at adequate compensation partly something that we all need to be aware of because we want to stay competitive with, we would like it to be seminary training and postgraduate education to be something that people consider instead of just saying, oh, I might have been interested, but no, I'm not going to go that route. Is that part of where this is coming from?
Yes, in the sense that when we did our comparison numbers and we benchmarked, the benchmarking work was to make sure we were in alignment with everybody else around us, so that we weren't as a
Well, I
Synod.
think I also wonder if from the national church it's not coming down, that we need to be addressing, are we competitive the church, throughout the country, competitive with other professionals?
I'll take both parts of that. There's actually two parts of that to me. The numbers vary widely across the church, the ELCA, I should say. And we're, as a Synod, staying in a very competitive place. We're not at the top end. We're definitely not at the bottom end. We're trying to stay in that middle spot compared to our peers. Whether um, um, a postgraduate, a master's degree that requires another 120 hours worth of work, whether we are in a competitive spot for salaries to other professions that would require similar work, that is hard for me to say whether that is true. And so that part I don't know that we're looking at, but certainly how do we stay in alignment with our other peers, and how do we try to stay in a place that provides fair, adequate, just compensation for the leaders. And so that's the balancing act we've been trying to do.
Pastor Wertz, at
Yeah.
the risk of talking too much, I've got another one. But y'all know me. To Ann's point, yeah, most pastors have, it's this call and you want to help people, and they don't know a lot about finances necessarily. They may not feel, and we don't have any education on how to negotiate these sorts of things. If you happen to have had it, you had it. There's nothing in seminary that would help with this. So the con that you articulated is a strong one for me, that you've got lots of folks who now are going to need to be better negotiators than we can reasonably expect them to be. So that question about how the Synod is going to be involved and how the conversations are going to be happening, that would be a huge one, I think, for people to have the answer in front of them for, if they're going to vote yes for this. And then, so my question would be, if we were to vote this down, what is the alternative plan?
Sure.
Go back to, I'll let you answer it.
Yeah, no, so the alternative plan falls in a couple of different ways. So one, there is no alternative plan at the moment. The task force came with this recommendation. The Senate Council endorsed the recommendation and said, this is what we have. The Constitution does not require the Assembly to approve compensation guidelines. Tradition and we think good practice in the Virginia Synod has been for this to be something that is approved by the Assembly when we gather an Assembly. But if this were to be voted down, then it would be referred to the Senate Council, and the Senate Council, taking the wisdom of the Assembly voting this down, would need to come up with a different plan. My guess is we would take a no vote as a recommendation to look back at the old plan. But that would become a Senate Council action and a Senate Council decision at that point, because we wouldn't have another assembly to be able to bring this back to.
I have a handful of announcements that I'd
Oh,
like to share. So if anyone has final thoughts or questions, raise your hand, put them in the chat while I just kind of run through a few other things as it pertains to continuing to prepare for the assembly. We also have a variety of elections at this Synod Assembly, and all of the nomination forms for those are still open, and those remain open until May 14th in order to be included in the full bulletin of reports. We also have slots still available for our appointed at-large voting members. Those are voting members that are appointed by the Synod Council that are either BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, folks whose first language is other than English, or youth or young adults. So if you know someone in your congregation or another Virginia Lutheran that fits that, you can nominate them or ask them to consider that. Resolution forms are also due on May 14th, and then registration closes on June 3rd. We cannot register anyone for the assembly after June 3rd, per the Constitution. We also cannot change any of your voting members after June 3rd. So chances are, if you're here tonight, you're already registered, but on the off chance you're not, or you're a roster minister and you've still got to get your folks on the list, please be sure to do that. And the next pre-assembly meeting will be Tuesday, May 20th, and that one will be about changes that are coming to the Constitution. Those documents will be available to you soon for you to be able to review to prepare for that meeting. Seeing nothing else come in the chat, I hope you'll join me in thanking both Treasurer John and Pastor John for their financial wisdom and leadership in these matters.
Thank you, Pastor Colleen. Bishop, any word from you to
I'm just excited to see everyone who's interested about what's going to be happening at Synod Assembly, especially where the investment and ministry plan and the compensation guidelines are concerned. So I appreciate your investment of time tonight. And thank you, John and John.
Thank you all. All right. I hope everyone has a good rest of the evening. Thank you. Goodbye.